Dear ladies and gentlemen, дорогі українці, after the first post-pandemic annual Congress of PEN International in Uppsala, Sweden, I should say with quite a rich public program on Ukraine too, which could be seen on our Facebook page, we are continuing the series of conversation with intellectuals in Ukraine, with those around the world keen to be closer to the root sources. The main focus of those events is growing awareness about what is happening right now. Our speakers from Ukraine will share the last updates in their personal experience. Therefore, we will analyze freedom of expression landscape, future-looking perspective, and expected changes in societies, states, role, and responsibility of writers all around the world. And this is an episode number 31. Після першого постпандемічного річного конгресу наживо, що відбувся в Упсалі, у Швеції, мушу сказати, з досить потужною публічною і непублічною програмою про Україну, з нею можна запізнатися на нашій Фейсбук-сторінці, ми продовжуємо серію розмов з інтелектуалами в Україні і з тими, хто по всьому світу прагне бути ближче до першоджерел. Основним фокусом наших заходів є обізнаність про те, що відбувається саме тепер. Наші спікери з України діляться останніми новинами та своїм особистим досвідом. Ми аналізуємо ситуацію у ландшафті свободи слова, перспектив майбутнього та очікувані зміни у суспільствах, державах, а також роль і відповідальність письменників у всьому світі. В етері епізод номер 31. This is a project of PEN Ukraine, whose team is a perfect example of courage and dedication to the freedom of expression in those difficult times. And project is sponsored by PEN International, which has continued to provide a platform for freedom of expression for those currently under the highest risk. Це проєкт «Пен Україна». Це команда, якого є чудовим прикладом відваги і відданості свободи слова у ці непрості часи. Співорганізатором проєкту є Міжнародний ПЕН, що продовжує надавати платформу для свободи вираження поглядів тим, хто перебуває у групі найвищого ризику. The project is implemented with the support of the US Embassy in Ukraine, and our traditional partners are PEN America, the Ukrainian Institute London, Ukraine World, Local History, Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute, the Harman Institute at Columbia University. We will stream today's event to all partners' Facebook pages. Нагадую, що проєкт втілюється за підтримки Посольства США в Україні, і нашими традиційними партнерами є PEN Америка, Український інститут Лондона, Україна Світ, Локальна історія, Український науково-дослідний інститут Гарвардського університету та Інститут Гаррімана при Колумбійському університеті. Ми транслюємо сьогоднішню подію на всі партнерські сторінки у Facebook. My name is Olga Mucha and I will introduce our today's guests. And I'm reminding you that our conversation is in English. Захід відбуватиметься англійською мовою. So today we are delighted to host Kateryna Babkina, Ukrainian poet, prose writer, columnist, screenwriter, and playwright, and also quite a popular blogger, I should say. She's an author of 4 poetry collections, a novel in short stories, and 2 collections of stories. She has also written books for kids, which are extremely popular and about to launch a new one in London tomorrow, but no word. Kateryna was the first Ukrainian author to be invited to have readings in the Library of Congress in Washington. And last year, she won the Angel's Central European Literature Award for the My Grandfather Danced Better Than Anyone Else, published in Polish language. Basically, the most important thing I want to tell you about Kateryna is that she's the one who brings a lot of attention to Ukrainian culture in different ways. Obviously, sometimes through the publications. She also written a lot for Esquire, Le Monde, Harper Bazaar, and other media, but also sometimes could be through posts on her private blog, which could be quite harsh and controversial, I would say. But this is something about Ukrainians, isn't it? And Kateryna will hold her conversation today with Askold Melnyczuk, an American writer but Ukrainian origin, academic whose publications include novels, essays, poems, memoirs, and translations. Among his works are the novels What is Told, Ambassador of the Dead, House of Widows. You already should be excited to read just from the titles. And his works has been translated into German, Polish, Russian, Ukrainian. He founded the journal Agni and Arrowsmith Press back in 2006. and also received a number of awards since 1991. If I will start to number them, will be ended with our time assigned. And what is most amazing about Askold's work is how he embeds the Ukrainian ethnicity into the American culture. This is what always was surprising from your novels. Also, he teaches in the University of Massachusetts, Boston. And I just read his last article about teaching creative writing to Ukrainian students. That's really very new angle for us those days. What unites those two, and now I'm joining the team, this is a genuine belief that Ukraine will have a proper place in world culture in the future. Ukraine has only recently begun to enter world literature, but now even being in all the news around the world is barely present in literature environment. Speaking about the image of Ukraine in modern American literature, I remember your example, dear Askold, when you said that after turning the pages of about 4,000, I believe, American novels, in the last 10 years, you found only 3 places where Ukraine was mentioned in one way or another. I believe this is what is going to change. And how it will be done is to be discussed right now. So that's my warm invitation to take the stage. Floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Olya, for that wonderful introduction. And Kateryna, what a pleasure to finally meet you. I've heard so much about you. And so let's embark on this conversation. We have a lot to cover. I wonder first, though, as the person speaking about what is happening in Ukraine, if you could give us all a bit of an update about what you've heard of what's happening there today.
Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Askold. It's really, really very important to meet you finally, almost in person. What's happening in Ukraine? There are like 2 layers of life there, and on the layer number 1 that I see, families, friends of mine, children, people, bosses, workers are trying to keep up the life going on there, like giving the prize to the best teacher on the International Teachers Day, creating some culinary competitions, writing and publishing books, organizing events, playing concerts, doing fashion collections, providing other people with help, information, whatsoever. And then there is this another, and if you look at that briefly, like let's say via Instagram or talking to people like on a daily basis, you might even lose those, I wouldn't even say tiny, just the red line of going on war, which means basically awful news every day, even though recently, like a week or 2, it's looking really better from Ukrainian side, because I've checked today, like all the Kharkiv region, I believe, has been like now free from Russian occupation. But every day people are dying. Every day they are discovering new war crimes on the territories that were occupied. Every day some new people are getting into capturing by Russia. Every day, like all the time, you get this war reality, and it influences both people who are in Ukraine, not of course not in the same way, but this information like influences in hearts and damages both people who are in Ukraine now and people who are temporarily living abroad, like I am, because I have a small child, and at the beginning of March I fled to Poland and then temporarily moved to London, because I'm not able to guarantee her safety, especially after knowing what had happened in Bucha and Irpin. I do understand that that's probably the best solution for a lot of like Ukrainian women, especially those who have children, when your hands are preoccupied with something all the time, that they probably leave to Western Ukraine or abroad, because otherwise we would have like more victims and more awful stories to hear. And more awful stories to tell, obviously, because what is happening now in Ukraine is so unacceptable, so impossible that as I talk to people from abroad, not only I experience this like Ukraine fatigue when they are hearing about the war for 7 months, but there is something else. The things that happening there are so unbelievably impossible that it's really difficult for them to accept that those things are really going on there. So
Yeah,
we like kind of have to talk about that. Nobody likes the negative messenger, the people who are like telling the bad stories, but this is something important to understand the whole
it's a,
the whole
no, Kateryna,
event.
it's essential. It's essential. You know, I have a friend, well-known American literary critic who speaks about the myth of the blue sky. That is to say that, you know, we are sitting here. I'm just outside Boston, and although today is a cloudy day, you know, very often it's a beautiful and sunny day, and things are peaceful on the streets, and the immediate reality around us is so unlike what so many in Ukraine are experiencing, and it becomes a real kind of cognitive dissonance to try to accept this reality. I still, 7 months in, wake up and find it hard to believe that this is happening, because it happens so much without a cause, without any sort of provocation, without any reason, and that is, you know, it is the irrationality of the reality that I think makes it so very difficult for those of us who are well aware of what is happening to accept it. Therefore, it becomes a kind of interesting and yet essential project to attempt to create those sort of platforms that you have to take those who are not in any way aware of, we're not aware of Ukraine at all, to take in and understand the radical difference in daily experience between here and there. It is, you know, I think that people are naturally empathetic, and if they are able to really hear what is happening, they will respond, as I do think that in a great many of them are responding in the United States. I don't know what it is that you're hearing in Europe, in London. I've spoken to various Ukrainian writers who've said that the tone of the conversation is different in Europe than it is in the United States.
It really depends, I believe, on people you're talking to. Like generally people are empathetic, very supportive, and very pro-Ukrainian, but
Yes.
it only like works when we are talking to some rather educated people aware of history, aware of some political events, aware of what had Russia done before to Georgia, Chechnya, other countries. But then also more and more I hear the voices like, you know, like the tweet of Elon Musk yesterday,
Sure.
when he said just maybe generally, what if we just find a way to end the war? Ukraine should stay neutral, the Crimea should stay Russian. What? Like, really, what? Especially when you met in person some people from Crimea or from like
Sure.
the eastern Ukraine, which is occupied already for 8 years. And they are telling like, what is like, you give away our home for what? For people don't pay like higher bills on gas or energy somewhere in Europe. But what I really like is that, I mean, what I really like in this context, which is not generally likable at all, is that people are getting more and more into it, and they are really trying to understand, not quickly taking the side of, you know, paying less bills and more people dying, let's call it that way, like.
Mm-hmm.
And because this is like the coverage of all those I would say, sorry, ugly positions. Like, just
Sure.
let's give Putin whatever he wants. Let's give Russia whatever they want. Let's forgive all the deaths and all the rapes and all the crimes. For then people will stop dying. They won't, because Russia won't stop. Russia has been doing this for years and years and years to different countries in different contexts. And if they are not stopped, they will keep doing that. And also, like, Ukraine has been a victim of Russia for years, hundreds of years. So it's not really the way to stop people dying, but instead of, taking the simple side, the populistic side of less bills, less people dying, just like let Russia have whatever they want, people are really trying to understand what is going on. And
Yes.
in
Yes. No,
long term, this is very important, and of course better for basically for everyone, for the world, that people are really aware of what is going on somewhere, even, which seems to be far away, because, like, especially before Maidan and before 2014, the start of the war, they knew something, of course, of Ukraine, but not that much on its history, really, and on its importance. Now more and more people in Europe are becoming aware that Ukraine is like the border between the
yes.
crazy Russian world and
Well, a fascistic world,
it's like
a mafia
normal set
state,
of minds,
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. It's funny because I think of a line by a poet who might not normally be considered in this context, Bertolt Brecht, who wrote in a poem that if you don't stand up for yourself, you'll go down. Surely you see that. And it is in fact the fact that Ukrainians have stood up for themselves, the fact that they knew enough to stand up to a bully because they had experienced bullying before, is what has moved people so much. That's one of the elements that they have really they have prioritized freedom over slavery. They have prioritized liberty over serfdom. They have, in fact, stood up for democracy worldwide and have become emblems and champions of what it means. When you have silly people like Elon Musk, who with all his potential for doing good, all the resources that he has, is after all fantasizing about leaving the earth and going to Mars. I mean, you talk about escapism, an escapism from the current reality of our planet, a planet that is whose ecology is being damaged and destroyed by this war. After all, you have to consider the human cost and the larger kind of planetary consequences of what Russia and Putin are doing, and to see them as a kind of criminal enterprise that needs to be arrested in its tracks. In fact, Ukraine has become a kind of inspiration for many of us. I work with a political group here in the United States called Writers for Democratic Action. We have some 3,000 members nationwide and a great many across Europe as well. And it is our goal to preserve democracy here in the United States because it itself is under siege. One of the really interesting sort of elements of the conversation that I've discovered here in the United States is that it is a very specific segment of the well, I mean, I hate to generalize, but I have to say the Republican Party that has quietly been supporting Putin, and perhaps not even so quietly, but is now kind of increasingly loudly and proudly speaking out in support of and encouraging Ukraine to give up. And that, it's a really kind of interesting psychological problem. How do you let people who have known certain degree of liberty their whole lives, and I don't know that anybody knows complete and utter liberty. We're all sort of the victims of our social and familial context, after all. But the idea that you can speak truth to power still, that you can criticize the government, that you can criticize institutions here, is something we've come to take for granted. It's a privilege not enjoyed in Russia, but however experienced in Ukraine. And it is precisely for that freedom and that right that it seems to me that people are fighting. And I suppose that's the point I'd most like to make. I don't want to belabor this, but it seems to me to be what has turned Ukraine into a kind of an emblem of how much democracy matters. I'd like to say that democracy is not a gift, but a prize that has to be won over and over again, and that it is worth fighting for.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I have a right to say we are fighting for, because I'm like kind of not there at the war, though participating is also as I can. But what Ukraine fights for now is not only those, high shelf values like criticizing the government and freedom of speech and whatsoever, but every day, like here in London, I go to the playground and my child who's 2 years old meet other children, and she has a friend, Evie. Evie is a surrogate daughter of 2 guys. She has 2 daddies. They are living their life and having their child and doing their jobs, being happy couple, going to the playground in the evenings. This is something people do not enjoy in Russia as well, and will never be enjoying this kind of. They are just not able to be themselves, and Ukraine has been a bumper between the world of violence and forcing people to stay at some not nice circumstances and having a shitty life, but dedicated to the huge values of I don't know what, because for me it's not understandable anymore. Though I grew up in the Soviet context, of the huge war, until some certain age, because of the films, tales, the book we read, since that my grandmother and grandfather would tell me the stories, I thought that, and also this is the story of my mom, that she used to be telling me earlier, that in all this context, for instance, she was all her childhood thinking that the war is something that had to happen from time to time in their country, so everybody goes and dies and suffer, because the meaning of life is being great at war. So being ready to die at some point for unclear values. And this was the experience of also my childhood, that the Soviet people, or later on the Russian people, are so good, so great, that we don't need all the good things of democracy, individual freedom, personal freedom, whatsoever, of course, freedom of speech, nothing of that we do not need, because we are great and ready to die for something at any point. So this is what is going on there now, and Ukraine is being the bumper between those dark vision of it's not so bad. From my experience, it's super. I know it does not sound fancy and it's super simple, but they say we are having shitty life. We don't have this, that. We can't develop. But we don't need this all, because we are great, and so we're gonna everyone and show that Russia sucks, but it is still better and greater. I don't see any logic under this whatsoever, and of course people in Europe do not see it as well, because they are very far from that context. But I know people from Russia. I used to know, I guess we tell now, because I don't keep, I believe, contacts with any of my Russian acquaintances anymore. It's useless, but they are not only brainwashed, but this is their choice to say this.
Sure, the state has become, not only an ideology, but a religious sort of a kind of standard, become a religious faith, really, a religious faith in the state. I mean, and that was part of what I think had happened with communism, and was part of the kind of Soviet mindset, which continues in Russia. You mentioned Ukraine as a kind of buffer, and Ukraine as the perpetual victim and sacrifice. And Arthur mentioned a piece that she had just read. I just published a piece on teaching creative writing to Ukrainian students via Zoom. I was co-teaching with Victoria and Melina, and one of the stories that we had our students in Ukraine read is by a great American writer, Ursula Le Guin. I don't know if you know her. She writes what is called speculative fiction here, and this is a really fabulous story called "Those Who Walk Away from Omelas." Omelas is this utopia. This is a 4-page short story. In this story, she really kind of condenses so much. Omelas is a utopia in which everyone is always happy. They celebrate kind of constant carnivals and festivals, and It's full of images of children laughing and banners rippling in the wind, and horses cavorting and people, right? It's just kind of pure joy and exuberance.
Yeah.
But there's a price for this utopia, and the price is that there's a little child of indeterminate sex in a basement of a decrepit old building, and everybody in this town of Omelas, when they reach a certain age, adolescence, at the age of 12, they're brought down to see this child, and they're encouraged to torture it a bit, to kick it. This child is poorly fed, lives in the dark, is tied up. It sits around, plays with its own feces, eats them, and people kind of come and torment it. But they are told that the price of their freedom and their joy is the imprisonment of this child. That for Omelas to be a utopia, this child has to be kept in the basement. And those who discover this are shocked. They kind of can't believe that here this poor thing is being tormented while they are enjoying their lives. But then they think about things and they say, well, okay, it's one child and there are thousands of us, so we'll be okay. And most people forget about it. There are a few, however, whose conscience will not rest, will not let them rest. And they decide to walk away from Omelas, from the utopia. So teaching this, and that's the whole story. Those who walk away from Omelas, those who leave the utopia. To me, the utopia is a bit like Disneyland. It is the sort of fantasy place in which people who really are not happy go to hide from themselves the fact that they're not happy. And it is a sort of a source of endless distraction and a way of avoiding reality. What was so moving and so startling was, I've taught this story to my American students in Boston, but the Ukrainian students all immediately recognized that they themselves were that child in the basement, and that so much of the rest of the world, of Europe, has been willing in the past to leave Ukraine as a buffer between itself and Russia. And what was so brilliant about the students is that they refused to accept the terms. They refused to believe that there are two choices only, that you either accept this or walk away. They said, why can't you fight for that child? Why can't you change things in this false utopia in order to bring that child out of the basement? And that seemed to me the
That was
wisest of
directly
answers.
like my idea. Sorry for interrupting you.
Please.
When you were like telling about the story, I was like, okay, but there are people who are okay with that, and there are people who walk away.
Yeah.
What about the people who are trying to rebel or change
Right.
this situation?
Exactly. That's right. There are the people who are not accepting the terms that are laid out for them, and they are choosing to be co-creators of reality. So one of the things that Olya, of course, mentioned was the way in which Ukraine had been perceived before the war, and we've talked a little bit about how Ukraine is being kind of reconsidered by the world. And I remember the reference to the talk that I gave in Kyiv 20 years ago, I think it was, at the Kyiv's Shevchenko University. At that point, I think Jonathan Safran Foer's Everything is Illuminated had just come out, and there had been actually quite a wonderful novel by Claire Massoud that had a Ukrainian as a character. There was one other book that had mentioned Ukraine, but really at that point, Ukraine was culturally considered a kind of a terra incognita. And I know that from my own experience, as when I was in graduate school, I would be translating poems from Ukrainian, and there would be graduate students in the class who had say, "Oh, well, that just sounds like Russian to me." But I had other experiences. I remember talking to Joseph Brodsky in Ukrainian, and he spoke to me in Russian. We neither of us understood each other, and so Joseph said, "Askold, this is America, so let us speak English." And so we found a kind of lingua franca in English there. But he certainly knew that there was a distinction. I wonder what you're finding about the ways in which Ukraine is beginning to emerge culturally in Europe.
Okay, first of all, I have to confess that my perception of Ukraine is changing rapidly during this full-scale invasion, because as many other people, I used to think that we have a weak army, that we are a rather poor country, that people are rather irresponsible. That was the heritage of the Soviet system, that nothing depends on you. So people really become those like kind of passive people who don't take responsibility for their life, their like cities, their whatsoever. So this changed, of course, rapidly, because basically where the state fails for this or that reason to solve some kind of question connected to the war, people do it by their own hands and by their own money. And that's probably the first example in the world's history when people are funding the army, the state army, by their private funds.
Mm-hmm.
It does not sound really nice, like taking that the state basically passed this duty down to people, but on the other hand, it works. And each of us is a state, each of us is Ukraine. So whatever I fundraise, whatever I donate, whatever I do to earn more money and send them to this or that need, either to refugees or to buying some equipment to the people who are fighting, makes me understand I'm not really poor. And each of us is not really poor because we are able to make enough money not only to maintain our living, but to maintain the army of our country, not in a long way of paying taxes and then collecting those money somewhere and distributing them in a different way, but just very directly. I go and I buy this number of this kind of equipments, or the satellite, or the Starlink, or whatsoever, whatever they need, like the cars. There are a lot of examples. I know everybody knows now about them, that because people really following the story, like the Ukrainian writer being buying cars for the army. What's that been, like 55 cars already that Andriy Lubka bought for the young Ukrainian writer, you know, bought and equipped 55 cars for Ukrainian military. Bam! And everybody, basically each of us is participating in the war in this way. So after this, I won't really ever call Ukrainians irresponsible. And I know for sure that for a lot of people, this is probably the first time they took so much responsibility of what is going on in their country, in their life, and with their future, which is kind of cool. But also like talking about, and of course, as people are more and more discovering Ukrainians directly, people are stopped being surprised, let's say, that I can speak English quite all right. I mean, it's not the perfect language, of course, and I believe you all notice my mistakes. I'm sorry, but previously when I used to travel, I was do the business trips or with readings or something. Everybody was saying, "Oh my God, you're so English speaking." Normally, people from Ukraine or Russia or somewhere there not so good in English. So now a lot of like educated and qualified Ukrainian people came to different countries, and people saw them and they thought, "Aha, okay." So probably the education is not so bad in our country. Of course, what is connected to the attitude towards the personality and freedom, and this is rather still post-Soviet scenes, but coming to the knowledge or getting the qualification, getting the businesses which people discovered because of the war. There are a lot of cool things that people know now about Ukraine. And of course, culturally, I've been talking about this already in 2014, that Ukraine is gonna be trending now. When we talk about film, art, music, literature, we have and used to have and had always a lot of high quality artistic or cultural product, which was not discovered. And now, of course, it's gonna be discovered, so all the world gonna probably admire and be surprised how original, how cool, and how high quality scenes we can produce in terms of ballet, music, classics literature, but the price for this is kind of like people buy dead people and raped children, and that is how they discover Ukraine. So
Oh, yeah, well, that's a well
I
said.
would prefer stay less published and less recognized, but not
No,
being
I know exactly
this
what
is
you
not
mean.
something we have chosen.
No,
So
I know
I'm
exactly
not
what you
sure
mean.
this is something you expected to hear from me, but
No, I know, I'd actually know exactly what you mean, because I have had friends, political scientists, literary friends who say, look at all the publicity Ukraine is getting, look at all the press, now everybody knows. And I'm thinking to myself, I'd sooner have anonymity than this kind of death and slaughter, and to fly under the radar, but have a normal life, than to be brought to public attention at such a cost and such a price. No, I wholeheartedly agree that it is to say that it's deeply unfortunate is a profound understatement. This is what it has taken. At the same time, it is the fact that this is what has happened and this is what it has taken. And so we have to come to terms with these realities quickly and respond appropriately. In part because, having, I also entirely agree with you that it's been the really improved educational system in Ukraine that has created a generation, your generation, that has gone out into the world, gone beyond the borders. Has, after all, the first generation that has been actually free enough, right? Both politically free and financially capable of going outside the borders and entering, working in Massachusetts, in Boston, working in London, working in Singapore, and traveling in the world, and knowing other languages and cultures directly and experiencing them. That has created a kind of a certain the strength of numbers, so that I certainly remember being the token Ukrainian in so many sort of situations, having lived almost entirely in a kind of in the American literary culture world, and not in the diaspora world itself particularly. And it's heartening to see this sea change. But yeah, absolutely. At what cost?
I have to say we also used to be the first fear-free generation. The first fear-free generation who was growing up rather safe. We were yet too small when the Soviet Union collapsed, so where the darkest times and dangerous times were happening, we were like kind of very small children. And then all of it, before 2014, all of it felt rather good. And uprising was different, of course, different like ups and downs, better government, worse governments, Maidan of 2004, which we actually won. So that was kind of improvement of our power and whatsoever. And basically before they started shooting people at Maidan, we were a really fear-free generation, which influenced us a lot. And now we are not anymore. Probably then my daughter's generation gonna be the first fear-free generation again. She's 2 years old now, so she did not really understand what had happened to us. She enjoyed it so much, the nights in the bomb shelter, when I was like scared to shit because they were bombing the city I live in, and this was not something I would expect. Like nobody did, even though we were like aware of this might happening, but you don't really believe this can happen to you. Like nobody does. And she was enjoying it so much because she loves dogs, and we had to give away our dog when she was 4 months old, so we didn't have a dog in the house. And then she would go at night to the bomb shelter where everybody would bring the dog. She had never seen so many dogs at one place before. She was the happiest child ever because all kinds of dogs, cats, and whatever animals were there and ready to interact. She did not understand why we left the house. But she's super happy because she has a new room, new toys, new park, new friends, new whatsoever. And probably they're gonna be now, if we succeed to end this war, like to end it completely, because it was never ended. I grew up at Western Ukraine. And so I have to tell that from the beginning of my life, I have this background knowledge, even though I grew up in pro-Soviet family of my grandfather was the military man of Soviet army, and then when he retired, he was a teacher of scientific communism at the local university. But even like staying there in this Western Ukrainian context, I knew for sure at the background that one day Russia gonna attack us. That was like the common knowledge, you know, the sky is blue, the grass is green, there are good mushrooms and bad mushrooms, and one day Russia gonna attack Ukraine again. And we had a chance to stay the fearless generation, and it did not happen. So probably now the generation of children who are very young now gonna be the first fearless Ukrainians, like completely free. Even though we are the freest Ukrainians for ages compared to what it was before, but
I think that one of the reasons
experience now also.
One of the reasons they'll be fearless is because of the example that your generation is setting by fighting for freedom. There are a couple of points that you raised that I want to kind of touch on. One of the other sort of big changes in Ukraine is that your generation has also looked at the past and kind of been able to confront the past and a history that had not been unfolded and examined before. The history of the Holocaust in Ukraine, the history of the Holodomor in Ukraine. These were stories that were for so much of my lifetime buried. And I think that when you begin to look squarely at the past, you can actually begin to understand the present much more clearly. So there's that. One of the other sort of things that I do worry about, and I wonder if we can just talk about this for a minute, is that, so, you know, part of what horrified me was very personal in that I felt I was seeing my parents' lives all over again. You know, my parents grew up in during World War II. My grandfather had fought in the army in World War I, you know, both for the Austro-Hungarian army and then the Rzeczywistości later. And then they had to flee Przemyśl, Poland, where they had been living, you know, came here, and the whole sort of process of becoming an exile, a refugee, is complicated, and the consequences of war, the consequences of violence are passed on for generations. We now are much more aware of that than we were during my parents' generation, so that the kind of post-traumatic stress that everybody who experienced the war was really never dealt with in that generation. It is, and I've spoken to many Ukrainians over the last few months now, they will acknowledge that there's a great deal of, you know, PTSD that people are experiencing now, but adrenaline is sort of driving everybody forward and kind of keeping everybody moving and engaged, which is, you know, thank God for adrenaline, but it's, again, it's not what you want. It's not the way you wish to be engaged. There has to be a lot of kind of awareness for the post-war period in how to begin that kind of conversations and healing process, so that what you have all experienced in various ways, whether you've been on the front or had to leave home, also, you know, a hugely traumatic experience. And yes, your daughter is at that age where she is has the capacity to experience joy no matter what, even inside a bomb shelter. That's beautiful. But there is stuff that is passed on anyway, kind of unconsciously, that needs to be dealt with and talked about. And I just hope that that's going to be a process that is beginning even now, before the end of the war, and will continue for a while afterwards. So it's just about kind of being conscious of the realities of what happened and coming and facing them as quickly as possible, rather than denying them, which many people do. And they think that they are preserving their children from realities. It just doesn't work that way. So, but you know, I was also thinking, I just read and reviewed on Mariana Kijanowska's Voices from Babin Yar, you know, and that again is a very powerful example of facing up to a part of the history that had been kind of buried. And then, of course, there's the horror of seeing Babin Yar bombed again now, and you see the ways in which exactly what you said, this sense of awareness that Russia will attack again, is being realized in the very place where horrors have their own history. And to have that wound reopened is kind of incredible, but again, real, and we have to face it. I want to ask you a little bit about your own plans now, kind of moving forward. You're in London, and you've got a book that's coming out this week, and I wonder how you're sort of planning, looking ahead to the future.
What I learned from the last 7 months is that I do not build long-term plans now anymore. Of course, I'm looking forward to go home, like everybody is, but I do not know when this is gonna be possible. Because on the other hand, as a mother, I want to give safety to my daughter. And I mean, I'm probably staying here until the beginning of the summer, and then I will see if it's safe enough to go home. If not, then I will find some other solution. I'm like kind of privileged because I have some working contacts, and I speak a little bit some languages, so I can help myself. And like talking about writing and about speaking. So my plan is actually starting talking about what's going on already now. I've just finished a book. It's going to be published relatively soon in Ukrainian and in Polish. It needs to be edited, of course. It's a story about what is going on now and what had happened since February 24 for young adult auditory. Like I never wrote actually for not for teenagers, but for young adults. So this is my first experience. This is a novel for them about. I won't make a spoiler, but just finished it, and actually this is before before the full-scale invasion. It was very important for me in my writing to keep talking about our past, because this is something we did not do actually. In Soviet Union and in the post-Soviet times even, we had this only one version of history, very flat and very modified to the needs of the party and of the government. And the things that had happened really, and the trauma that people have had experienced was huge. And we did not have the habit, the possibility to talk about that. So it's been only now that actually Ukrainians have started writing about Holodomor. Like, okay, not only now, but let's say starting from 80s, which is like in terms of history of literature, more or less now. From 80s, they started really writing, talking about this, writing about Holocaust in Ukraine, about different sides of Second World War, about experiences of Chernobyl, about experiences of being a part of Soviet Union, which is itself traumatic experience. Sorry, this is true. Like just being there is traumatic enough. And only now we got those like voice powerful enough to go back to our future. And this has to do also something with our generation, which is the first fearless generation. Like I know that if I will write the truth about the past of my grandmother, nobody would come for me because I'm from the wrong origin, so I cannot go to university, have a job, or whatsoever. Like, still, my mother's parents experienced that, and even like my mother's sister, because father of my grandmother was taken at the 37 to Siberia and killed there. So all the family and all his daughters and their children were considered the enemies of the people. They were not let into the universities, into the good schools, into the nice jobs whatsoever. So I'm the first generation who can speak openly about what had happened then, and without being aware that somebody would come for me.
Right.
And this is very important for me to keep doing that.
Absolutely.
We still did not deal with the past, and we have more new things to talk about. So this is the job for the writers. This is the job for intellectuals. This is the job for writers, so for artists. And the other thing, which is kind of my plan, is what writer does, what is important, what writer does, like not in the historical term or in the like time-lasting terms, but for people now, is that we are able to give people vocabulary to talk about what had happened to them because the things that are happening in Ukraine are so awful that people do not know how to talk about that, what
Right.
words to use, what instruments to use to express themselves. So how we can help, like writing about what is going on now, writing about it now, is that we can give people the words that they share and like speak through the same words, through the same prose, poetry, songs, music.
Yes.
So they can just join this to express their own trauma and start talking about this. This is a very good start when you have the radio words to repeat, or
That's
when
right.
you have the poem to post on your
Right.
Facebook or whatsoever and to tell this is what I feel now.
Right.
So this is always an easier start to express your pain,
Right.
your fear, your whatsoever. So this is like kind of my plan for the closest time. Try
Important
to
and
be
essential
useful.
work. Important and essential work. Yeah, please keep doing it. Please keep doing it. I can't wait to read it.
Thank you so much. That's a horrible moment when I need to intrude, but I have a number of questions to you.
Wow.
Yes. So first of all, it's referring, thank you for the interesting discussion, and in reference to the image of Ukraine as a buffer, do you think this is slowly falling apart as Europe is becoming more concerned with the idea of more widespread conflict with the continent? Do you think this could be a wake-up call for wider action against fascism and extremism within the whole of Europe?
Well, I would say I sure hope so.
Yeah, I
mean-
believe so. I really hope so too.
I mean, because the other sort of version of it is that as the weather gets colder and as more inconvenience is experienced by a wider population, people begin to say, well, okay, that's just one country and we are, many countries. And that's the tension, I think, right now. And I think that is those who will accept Omelos and will accept that child in the basement. But my deep hope is that there are enlightened spirits who recognize that would only postpone the inevitable spread of the disease.
Yeah, I believe
Thank you so
people are becoming aware that if Ukraine is unable to stop this, which Ukraine needs support for, then Russia not gonna stop on Ukraine only. And luckily, there are people in Germany, in Czech Republic, in Poland, in so-called ex-social camp, who do still remember being a part of that shit. So
Right. That's right.
they probably will help other people to understand that this when you give this monster to feel the power, the monster becomes more and more hungry. So yeah, I'm
Right.
really hoping that people are stopping seeing us as a buffer forever. Instead, they understand that they need to.
They need to, and they can. And that's the other thing, that the very important thing that you sort of had mentioned earlier, Kateryna, is that you have to recognize that every act against injustice empowers you and empowers everyone who's experiencing it. There's no such thing as pure helplessness. There are different levels of resistance that can be enacted depending upon your circumstances. There is the resistance of the prisoner who goes on a hunger strike and brings attention to his plight and to the much broader plight of a larger world, and so that you're never without choices. I think that's what's so important for people to realize.
And to follow up, here is one more question, basically two more. What is the role of social media in influencing perception and awareness of the experience of war then?
Well, Kateryna, you sound like you're a maven in social media, so I'll let you take this one. I have much more sort of as an American, I'm much more aware of the damage that social media has done locally to our own sort of electorate by not believing that it should be a curated medium with editorial that takes editorial responsibility for its content. But that's a.
But it can't be so, and we now all know that. So, as social medias have a power to be a damage, they give people also the instrument to
counteract.
defend from this damage. And
Yes.
basically, I would say it's been a long time since social media just functions like any other medias, and also especially due to social media activities of Ukrainians now, all the world is now aware much more of the work of Russian propaganda instruments. So, and it's super important now. It became very open, and due to some simple analysis, you can see what was created for what purposes. And this, I would say, this increases the critical acceptance and critical look of people what they get through social media. So this basically helps everyone to be more safe informationally in terms of whatever information, whatever content they get. They just are learning now how to protect themselves from manipulative things. This is good. However, all the information can be both damage and
Well, I think
That's so
at the same
true.
time. Sorry, I'm for some reason my daughter is screaming behind the wall, so I was slightly lacking the vocabulary. Sorry.
you can't ignore. You can't ignore. A screaming child. This is like ignoring Omelas.
She wants to participate. She wants to participate. Believe
Absolutely.
she's not in the basement.
Good.
Yeah, that's very sweet. And just to continue the thing about the social media, I think that's a brilliant example has happened today with this tweet of Elon Musk and with a response of Volodymyr Zelensky. That was a
Yes.
great experience, right? Because he responded, for those who are not aware, that which one, as Elon Musk allowed his readers to choose one of the answers, Zelensky posted the same thing. Choose the one. Elon Musk who supports Ukraine or the one who supports Russia. That was brilliant, right? Very
Absolutely, sure.
clear. And this shows that social media can be a really very, very strong weapon against manipulation as well. You can play the same game.
Well, the
No,
tricky
absolutely.
moment. Sorry,
Sure.
because
No, I
sometimes.
was gonna say that the first time, I think it was Oksana Zabushko who made me aware of, the whole sort of term of hybrid war, right? And then of course people like Peter Pomerantsev writing about the kind of Russian propaganda machine brought to our awareness the deliberateness and the scale of propaganda, and partly because it had played such an important role in American elections. I think many of us who have been reserved and skeptical of social media, as I had been, because I had seen and emphasized the kind of negative consequences of it, I'm very aware now of how lucky Ukraine is to have Zelensky as its president at this moment, because this is someone who really understood the use of media. And that has been a great boon to the country in this war. At least I think so. And I think that all the sort of citizen journalists who, like so many of you, Kateryna, you and others who have offered firsthand and personal kind of testimony and who have pushed back and who have refused to stay on the sidelines, have indeed shown that this can be weaponized in two directions.
Yeah, true thing. And the last one, quite classical and requires a very short answer. The global reader is already ready to and able to perceive not only Ukraine as a state, but also the Ukrainian literature. What would you recommend to start with? Give you 3 titles.
Oh, that's a tough one.
It is.
That's a tough one. Let's see, Kateryna, let's, for safety's sake, so we don't get ourselves in any kind of hot water, choose a couple of classics. So in part because I just read it, and she is debuting on the London stage in sort of several formats, the first thing I'd recommend is Lesha Ukrainka. So there are 2 ways to connect with Lesha Ukrainka right now. If you happen to be lucky enough to be in London, there's a performance of Cassandra, one of her most celebrated plays, translated by Nina Murray, that is being put on at the London stage. Perhaps you, Kateryna or Olya, can give your viewers the precise address. And then there is a new translation of Lysova Pisnya, which has just been published and which I strongly recommend, translated by Patrick John Cornice and also available online in a translation by Vidlana Tkach and Wanda Phipps. So that would be my first recommendation.
Okay, I never choose to stay on the safe side, so I needed 3 titles I would recommend for sure. Serhii Žadan, either The Orphanage or the Voroshilov, which is called in English, I believe, The Brief History of Jazz at Donbass Region, this kind of title. Then what else I would recommend you to read? I'm trying to pick up something like really widely translated, but probably, yes, go for The Museum of Abandoned Secrets of Oksana Zabushko. This demands a lot of patience and the possibility to digest long sentences that last for 5 pages, but you will get a nice overview of Ukrainian history and Ukrainian mentality as well. And yeah, why not try to go for Kateryna Babkina's books, either The Kepi and the Veil for Children or My Grandfather Danced Better Than Everybody Else, which is like the story collection. I feel free to do that. Sorry.
Sure, and I absolutely. I would also, since you dared recommend Zabushko's Museum of Forgotten Secrets, I would also recommend her selected poems, because there you see the range, and you also see some of the in the short essays that are included in that, outlining the situation of Ukraine before the war and Ukrainian culture before the war. I would
so
also
then I replaced Kateryna Babkina for this one too in my recommendations.
Well, I was going to say that
he still had 2 vacant spaces, so I would add also novels of Askold Melnyczuk, because I really
I would also add the poetry of Oksana Lutsishina, who happens to be teaching in the United States, but brings so much of the lore and history of Ukrainian literature to bear, both in her fiction and in her poetry. One of the kind of remarkably positive developments has been my own deepened connection with and understanding of a knowledge of the depth and breadth of quality Ukrainian literature being published right now, so that the reason that I've hesitated, Kateryna, from naming is because there are so many things that I would like people to read so that we could have conversations about them. Artem Chekh, Asayev's experience in prison, that also in isolation is really kind of important read to understand the complexity of the personal dynamics in Eastern Ukraine, the sort of ways in which neighbors began to argue and fight with neighbors. So they're in part, I would need to tailor these recommendations to particular readers and want to know what it is they want to learn about, whether it's about the breadth and depth of Ukrainian literature, in which case there are also things like Podmohylny's The City to recommend, just out in a new translation by Max Tarnowski. And I think that Lutsishina has just published a book, rather an essay on that in the Harvard Ukrainian Studies Review. So again, it's just it's a frustrating question because the list is long.
Because it requires another hour for.
Yes, you can start and ever end. Also, we mentioned Mariana Kianovska's books on Babyn Yar, which is deep and profound and great piece for understanding.
And personally, I've been engaged in translating the poetry of Marianna Savka. And what's sort of quite radical there for me is I translated some poems of hers when she was in the United States 15 years ago. And I compare them to the sort of work that she's writing now. And I see the kind of psychological transformation of a whole generation to be writing poems about free jazz on the one hand in 2006, and then poems about My God Supports the War. You suddenly say, whoa, something has happened here. And it is kind of charts an evolution, necessary evolution in the responsiveness of writers to the moment.
Thank you so much. Thank you for this conversation and for not sugarcoating things or holding them into the paper. there were a number of important points you raised, and a new perspective of refugees, as Katya said, mostly young women with little kids, about PTSD, post-traumatic experience to be rewarded. We had this short chat before going live about the people who used to live on the border. And it's quite scary thought to stay those borderline people, not be able to live in, let's call it, regular or normal environment. So that's a very important issue to speak about Ukraine in very real terms, not only about inspiration, but also huge risk to stay this kind of a buffer. And if you, our readers and viewers, would ask yourself, what can I do today? I would say, discover Ukraine your own way, through theater, arts, literature, music, cuisine, and be surprised. But always remember the price which has been paid for this trend and publicity. And this is what our dialogues are about, looking for sometimes very rough and not sweet answers, but raising awareness. This all would not be possible without the support of our partners, the US Embassy in Ukraine, Pan America, the Ukrainian Institute London, Ukraine World, Local History, Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute, the Harman Institute at Columbia University. The gratitude, of course, to Pan Ukraine, which continues to stand at the front lines in the name of freedom and truth. Pan International is proud to be a platform that supports freedom of expression. Thank you again, our great speakers. That was a pleasure and honor.
Thank you very much.
And
Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone.
thank you, our viewers. The next episode will be held this Thursday, October 6th at 6 p.m. Kyiv time, 4 p.m. London time. We'll be hosting Olena Husseinova, Ukrainian writer, journalist, radio host, and an author of several cultural initiatives, and Pavel Pinyonczyk, Polish journalist and war correspondent who writes about the war conflicts in Ukraine, Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Follow our dialogues on war, spread the word, and stay with Ukraine. This is our shared responsibility today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.